All right, so folks, I think given our timing and given that this is a very brief learning community conversation on what I will just share a personal statement, I believe are very important topics. I'd like us to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody. I want to say welcome to anyone who may be joining our learning community conversation for the first time. And I want to say welcome back to many of you whom I've had the great opportunity to see a couple of days in a row now, which I really appreciate. It's always such a pleasure to see friendly faces, and very glad to be here with all of you to facilitate this learning community conversation on LGBTQIA plus 16, cultural humility, and the use of motivational interviewing as a way to engage and retain LGBTQIA plus 16 people in care. Now, before we take care of any logistics, I have to ask this question, and I'm very curious to see if anyone will respond to this, but I'm very curious to get a sense of, anybody want to comment on why I've entitled this train? And Paul, I know you can't verbally, but if you want to write anything in the chat, feel free, because Paul's mic's not working right now. But anybody want to comment on why this learning community conversation is intentionally titled LGBTQIA plus 16? Does anybody have any thoughts or any reactions as to why I've specifically titled? Sage, I love the smile on your face. And I don't know if you might want to unmute and say something about that. No? Okay. All right, fine. I give you the opportunity to pass. You don't ever have to comment if you don't want to. But I'm wondering if there's anybody who has any thoughts about why it's been intentionally titled LGBTQIA plus 16. Any thoughts, any reactions to that? Because I want you to know that when I developed this course, I chose that title very intentionally. So any thoughts? Anybody want to 16? Oh, let's see. A couple of people are typing things in the chat. 16 different gender identities. Yeah, probably, and probably many more, Penny. Inclusion and diversity, Susan Beth says. Atia says, inclusivity, it's important to remind folks that the community is more than just the letters. And Larry writes, no clue. All right. So, excellent, Larry. Thank you. So there's a very specific story as to why I've called it this. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to work with a colleague of mine, an extraordinary person and trainer, a gentleman named Dr. Tom Freeze. He's located in Sage. You know Dr. Freeze, or you know of him. Yeah. I have had the opportunity to co-train with him, and specifically around LGBTQIA plus 16 issues. And he said to me once, and said to the learning community once, you know, this acronym is an acronym that keeps expanding because people feel safe. They feel like they can share their identity or their identities. And he said at his last count, and this was a couple of years ago, there were probably 16 other letters or numbers that could be added to that acronym. Yeah, and the reason that I called it this was because, yes, I wanted to be inclusive and I wanted to acknowledge, yeah, and Noelle is asking the $10,000 question is, what are they? Well, what I can tell you, Noelle, is I don't know all 16 of them, and no one in this learning community probably ever will. And more will probably present themselves. So the reason I wanted to mention that is because we want to be clear, and somebody I thought so eloquently put it in the chat, that the people that we're providing services to or that we're providing care to are much more than just these letters or numbers that possibly describe one facet, one piece of their identity, which is either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And what I want to assure everybody who's part of this learning community conversation is everyone in this learning community conversation, regardless of how you identify, has a gender identity, has a sexual orientation. A couple of other things are coming in the chat. Let me take a moment to read them. Yeah, and Larry's mentioning we also might not agree on them. That's very true, Larry, and meaning that we may use other words or names or definitions to describe ourselves. Sage writes, the letter or title is not a definition of their sense of self, but rather one facet of their intersectionality. Beautifully put, Sage. And again, this idea that someone's identity is a combination of multiple things, not just their sexual orientation, not just their gender identity. Why is it that nobody may never know? I'll tell you why, Paul, and I'll tell you why I said that. I said that because as this community continues, as these, and I actually, let me rephrase that, as these communities continue to grow and evolve, new language is always being developed. So some people come to a learning community conversation like this because they say, I want to learn the right terminology. I want to use the right words. And that's not a bad thing. You know, if you're speaking to me and you want to use the pronouns that will show the most respect to me, you can read my name under my chat. My pronouns are he and they. So great, you know that now. And the reason I mention that is because probably the best person to be telling you how they identify, what terms they use, what words, is the person that you're sitting across from. And the point I really want everybody to walk away with is that is an ever-evolving sort of set of identities. It's not fixed. And I'll tell you, for some people, that can present kind of a mind-bending challenge. And I'll give an example of that as we go forward. Okay? Excuse me, we have 103 people in the learning community. Wow, welcome. So glad you're here. Having said that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to just take care of a couple of logistical details. There we go. All right, so folks, as we engage in this learning community conversation, and by the way, 69 of you have responded so far, thank you. As we engage in this learning community conversation, we want to keep in mind that because we are a learning community, because you are invited to share your perspective, your thoughts, your experience, and your belief, what we talk about, what I share, what you talk about may not necessarily reflect the official views of our funder. And that's okay, because this is a learning community conversation. As we talk with each other, we want to be intentional about the language that we use. Words do have power. We want to be speaking with each other in a way that offers welcome, respect, and affirmation of recovery as we engage in this conversation. You know, because this is a learning community conversation, we don't all have to be in agreement. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for us to be able to engage in an intentional, respectful dialogue about these particular issues and to entertain differing perspectives, beliefs, and values. So again, if Noelle has the floor and she's making her point, hopefully nobody will interrupt her. You can certainly interrupt me, and you can unmute and you can ask questions or make comments or add information. But what I would ask is if somebody else has the floor, please don't interrupt them. And if you do want to add something or share a different perspective, just respectfully wait until they're finished and then feel free to jump in. You're more than welcome. And then the last one is we would simply invite everybody to consider speaking from the I. I can tell you, here's an I statement coming, that of late, we have had some extraordinary learning community conversations because members of the learning community have spoken from their own unique and individual experience. They've made very powerful I statements and shared their beliefs, their understanding, and their information, and it just makes for a richer learning community. So as a way of beginning this particular learning community conversation, and I'm sure you can see this picture of me as well as me, because I think that's how it works when I'm showing my slides with Zoom. I can't see you, but I believe you can see me. Yes, and Marguerite says, to Rome I must go. I have to tell you, Marguerite, I couldn't agree with you more if you have the opportunity to do so. And going there, I've been a couple of times, but going there, never for work though. I was never forced by the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center to go to Rome, but I have gone a couple of times. And the first time I went, because I had studied Latin for 4 years, I felt like I knew where everything was because our Latin teacher was so thorough about taking us through the culture and the architecture of ancient Rome. So I felt like I could have led tours when I went there the first time. So in addition to that disclosure, I have a couple of more that I'd like to make, and then I'm going to follow that with a question. And I'll just remind you before I make these few brief disclosures that our learning community conversation today is LGBTQIA plus 16 possible other letters, and the tandem use of cultural humility and the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing as a way to engage and retain LGBTQIA plus 16 people in services and care. So I just wanted to preface my disclosures with that. So these are some disclosures that I'd like to make to our learning community about myself today. One is that I am of European ancestry. I, as someone of European ancestry, have benefited and continue to benefit within our current culture from what is defined as white skin privilege. I am a sex at birth male, and I experience what I define as cisgender privilege. And if you're familiar with the concept of cisgender, type a Y in the chat. If you're unfamiliar, type UN. But if you're familiar with cisgender simply means that the sex assigned at birth when I was born aligns with my gender identity. And I consider that a privilege because most of the time, unless I'm consciously acknowledging it or I'm discussing gender identity, most of the time I take my cisgender experience totally for granted. And I want to acknowledge that many people who don't identify as cisgender, who identify as transgender, don't have that privilege. They're often reminded of their gender identity or their gender expression frequently, and sometimes multiple times a day. So I just acknowledge that that is a privilege that I am aware that I have. My pronouns, as I said earlier, are he and they. I am monolingual. I did reveal that I studied Latin for 4 years, but there's not much call to speak it. So I am, English is my primary language. Both on my maternal side and my paternal side is a history of pretty extensive substance use, undiagnosed substance use, untreated substance use disorders. I was born in the year 1962, which makes me greater than 60 years alive. I, as a human being living in the culture that I currently live in, am aware that I have very clear conscious bias about things and people and experiences. And I'm confident and well aware that I have many unconscious biases that I may not necessarily currently be aware of. And I also, as someone in the helping professions, am aware that I have something which has been referred to and is often referred to in motivational interviewing, is what's called the fixing reflex. And the fixing reflex is when you see somebody in trouble, or when you see somebody is ambivalent about wanting to make a change, the fixing reflex is kind of a switch that gets flipped where I want to jump in and give the answer, make a suggestion, solve the problem, rescue, fix, solve, spare. And I know that I have that reflex, and I do my best to try and not act on it. So those are the disclosures that I wanted to share with you as a preface to this conversation. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a minute. And I see that many people have noted some things in the chat. Yeah, and Sage is also asking if we can address that cis is not a slur or an insult. It is just a title for those who fit into this definition you have given. Absolutely. And it is a title that some people choose to claim and others don't. I personally choose to identify as someone with cisgender privilege because I want to be reminded of the fact that it is a privilege, and most of my life I've taken it for granted, and a day at a time I try not to take it for granted anymore. Oh, and Larry is asking, what is the reason for not disclosing my sexual orientation? You know, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for that. It's an excellent question, Larry. And the way I will respond with it is any disclosures that folks choose to make within the context of the learning community are at their discretion. We get to decide individually which information we choose to share or not share within any context. So when I was thinking about this, I chose to disclose things about my identity that I felt might welcome other folks without making anybody feel pressured to disclose anything that they may not want to disclose. So it was an attempt to strike a balance in regard to welcome and safety and affirming people's autonomy, which, you know, Larry, you actually, wonderful question. And Larry, you actually prompt me to want to move to the question that I was going to ask. Is any other thoughts, folks, about, given the topic of this conversation, why I might have made these disclosures? And Larry, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to unmute, if you have any thoughts about why I might have made the disclosures that I did within the context of this training.
So, I mean, I have no problem with any of your disclosures. I have also worked with people who never disclosed their sexual orientation, and people who said straight folks do all the time. They disclose to clients that they're married, that they have kids. So yeah. Why should I be any different? Why can't I disclose that I'm a lesbian or that I'm a bisexual?
Right.
So
right.
You know, I've sometimes gotten in some of this discussions with people I supervise. And so I was curious about your response.
Yeah. Thank you. Any reaction to my response?
From me? No, I'm fine. I think we should feel safe to disclose as much or as little as we want to.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, Sage, thank you. Larry, thanks so much for starting us off. And thank you for such a great question. Yeah, go ahead, Sage. I saw that you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something kind of in relation to Larry's comment. I
Please.
think it's important for those of us that do want to share that, though, we can normalize it, excuse me, on both sides of the conversation here. I'm very new in my position, and I've been meeting a lot of new people, and I've tried not to be hesitant to talk about the fact that I'm married, and I'm married to a woman, so we are in a lesbian relationship,
Yeah.
and being very open about saying my wife this, my wife that, when talking about what I do in my home life.
Yeah.
And hoping that, at the very least, if I'm open and upfront about it, I will get a read on people very quickly on who is safe, who is not, who needs education, that kind of thing. And
Mhm.
just kind of use that as sort of like a foot in the door to start some of the conversations based on what we're going to be talking about today, I hope.
Yeah. And I love the image that you shared, Sage, the idea that it can become a foot in the door because you can kind of take a read on where somebody is or isn't in regard to how you observe their reaction to your disclosure. Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts, folks, about why I chose to make disclosures about myself as the facilitator of this learning community conversation at the beginning of this conversation? Any other? Yeah, go ahead, Alex. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I threw it in the chat, but I think that it's, important to understand that people within this community's experiences are not monoliths, and our perspectives and experiences are painted and paint the way that we represent the experiences, right? So if we don't define the experiences or perspectives or realities that we have that can impact how we portray something, then I think it's almost easier for people to be like, oh, well, this person said that all gay people do this. So, you know what I mean? So we making sure that we can kind of clock the lens that we're seeing this through.
Yeah, and something, Alex, I love your language around this because I'm gonna say this so simply, and I'm gonna totally steal Alex language on this. Alex, I made those disclosures because I want to clock my own lenses.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge from the very beginning, folks, what I chose to disclose to you all impacts how I experience the world. I can never have the experience of a Latino or a Black man. It's just not possible. So I wanted to acknowledge that there are limitations to my lenses, and I'm actively trying to open up those limitations by acknowledging that those lenses exist. I can only see the world through the glasses that I've lived. Alex, is that a fair appropriating of your excellent clocking the lenses?
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. And I think, I'm a big believer that everyone experiences their own reality, and we are the experts in our own realities and experiences, right? And so not only remembering that, so when we're offering support to people, we can remember, okay, what am I missing? Because I don't know this life, but also to be able to encourage other people to clock that, like, what we say is also painted within our own reality.
Right. And meaning also, and Alex, tell me if you're okay with this, that I could be observing somebody else's experience, and because of my lenses, I may not understand how important, I may not understand the meaning, I may not understand the relevance to that particular person because I have not walked in their shoes. I'm not wearing their glasses.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that their experience is any less significant to them. It just means that I lack at this moment the ability to understand it. I may never. Is that fair, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So I see that a number of people put things in the chat. So let me just take a quick minute. We all have, Paulette writes, we all have limitations to our lenses. Melody writes, as a questioning queer female identified person married to a man, it's complicated. I try to use the word partner and mirror language. Stay aware that family and relationships come in many forms, but also the privilege of being straight passing if I disclose I am married to a man. Yeah, Melody, thank you. But also, it is an assumption and judgment by others to assume I'm straight because I am a woman married to a man. And you know something, Melody? I'm going to read that again because I could be completely wrong. And I could also imagine that what you just wrote there may be bending people's minds. So let me read what you wrote again. But also, it is an assumption and judgment by others to assume I am straight because I am a woman married to a man. So in essence, what Melody is saying is you can be a woman married to a man and not identify as straight. Yes, that is true. Melody, thank you so much. Sage, I have always thought that understanding our own intersectionality allows us to be more aware of what we do not know or have experienced. Sage, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's the essence of what this whole learning community conversation is about. And Paulette says, I have had to learn that the very hard way. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Paulette. We can certainly leave it at that, but if there's something you'd like to elaborate, you're more than welcome to. I'll just read these other couple of chats, and then if you want to jump in. Lawrence says, I agree, worked with a lot of minorities, and I would always acknowledge that I did not know what it was like to walk in their shoes. Just explain it to me. Jacqueline writes, I always refer to my spouse as spouse and never husband or wife. And some folks will assume I am married to a male, and some will assume I'm married to a woman, and very few ask. Wow, Jacqueline, very powerful. Jessica writes, people often assume I am lesbian when I refer to my husband as my partner instead of husband. Yeah, and again, this is just the word husband, the associations that people have, and the word partner that people have associations. People aren't minorities, they are minoritized, meaning that somebody has pushed them or labeled them into minority status, as opposed to them possibly being, quote unquote, minorities. Yes. So folks, a couple of other things came in the chat. I just want to, Melody says, wow, I never heard that word minoritized. That's powerful. Agreed. Barbara writes, it more accurately describes folks who we call minorities when in many communities, and Barbara, bing, bing, bing. Barbara's so right on the money. It often describes folks who actually within the community that's being described, they are the minority. So again, it's language that also has a structural racism component to it. Sage writes, I personally love the analogy of microaggressions as mosquito bites. Not a big deal when it's only one, but a swarm can break you. Yeah, and you know, Sage, I'm glad you added that, because I was thinking too when Paulette said, you know, oh, those little microaggressions. And I was thinking how those little microaggressions actually accumulate. And that's, you know, that swarm that can break us. Jessica writes, I can never understand, but I empathize with you. Yeah, and in essence, that's what we're really trying to do, is we're really trying to express empathy, and saying I understand can actually backfire. And even if you've had the same experience, you may not really be able to understand. Stephanie writes, microaggressions, death by 1,000 cuts. Yeah. And Jacqueline writes, there is a great YouTube video on microaggressions. Jacqueline, if you happen to have that YouTube video link, don't hesitate to pop it into the chat. Yeah, and Paulette, you're right. Sometimes saying I empathize doesn't go over either. So absolutely. It's really just about being in the moment with the person and doing our best to understand it from their perspective. And we're actually going to try and touch on that in the little bit of conversation we'll have about motivational interviewing. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. We are going to move a little bit forward. So I do need to make another, this isn't a disclosure, this is a disclaimer, that in this conversation, we are only literally going to touch the tip of the practice of motivational interviewing. In order to become proficient and skilled at this evidence-based practice, training and practice and receiving feedback are critical. So I do want to link the practice of motivational interviewing to cultural humility. And if you're interested in finding out more about MI, please join our additional learning communities that will focus specifically on MI. And in order to really become proficient in this evidence-based practice, it really does require the use of it, reflection on the use of it, and the receipt of feedback on your use of this evidence-based practice. So just keeping that in mind. So we really have two goals. One is that if we combine cultural humility with the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing, if we link these two together, we can actually better engage and retain LGBTQIA plus 16 people in care, because both cultural humility and motivational interviewing are person-centered, client-centered, and MI really does provide a framework how to better understand the person we may be providing services to. And they may identify with this particular community. Certainly the tandem use of both of these with any person, and I'll go back to what Sage said about intersectionality, we're all combinations of many different elements in our identities. So certainly cultural humility and motivational interviewing, if we're using these actively, we can use them intentionally to engage anybody. They can become particularly useful to LGBTQIA plus 16 people because they are attempting to understand and avoid judgment. I'm going to go back to my screen for just a second. The other reason that I think is probably something we all want to consider is this idea that the tandem use of cultural humility and motivational interviewing can be a very effective way to connect with, engage with people who've experienced trauma. And within our current culture, LGBTQIA plus individuals have experienced trauma and may currently be experiencing trauma. And they may be experiencing trauma on multiple levels, because imagine that maybe they're experiencing intergenerational or historic trauma in addition to current experiences of trauma. So when you think about the people that you provide services to, think about the idea that, you know, what percentage of the population of people that I provide services to, whether they identify as LGBTQIA or not, what percentage of the folks that I provide services to or interact with in the service setting have experienced or are currently experiencing trauma. And, you know, I've asked people at times, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but I have asked people at times to put that percentage in the chat. And sometimes people will very quickly type in 100%. And I can honestly say the lowest percentage I recall was somebody saying that 50% of their client census they suspected had experienced trauma. So that is pretty high up there. So what I'd like to throw out is that this learning community conversation really can provide the opportunity to also support trauma-informed practice. Tino writes, I was initially trained that intersectionality is being discriminated against because we are in two or more minority groups. The problem with this is it blames us as the problem. My child asks, so what wasn't that I don't, my child asked, so if something wasn't that, I wouldn't be hated? The reason for discrimination needs to be placed on isms like systemic racism, patriarchy, classism, and homophobia. Barbara, thank you so much for that. Barbara writes, amen. Intersectionality is the experience of being in more than one group, not the reason for someone else's hate, very truly. That's like blaming a woman for being assaulted for wearing a low-cut top, etc. Predators are predatory. They are not to blame. We are not to blame for other people's bad thinking or bad behaviors, truly. Savannah says, I was going to mention systemic discrimination. It is real and very necessary to address and acknowledge. I believe it is important to use terms such as marginalized and minority as a way to bring awareness to these realities. These terms are not just in reference to race, but of course, gender identity, sexual orientation, sexual expression, economic status. These terms are a way to educate, not further stigmatize. Yeah, and again, I think we have to be conscious of people have different relationships to these terms. Jessica writes, 100% of suicidal adolescents I work with have experienced some sort of trauma and or attachment barriers. Sage writes, living in East Tennessee, I can confidently say that right now, at least 90%, if not 100 of our LGBTQ plus community feel some form of trauma, be it from family or overarching political climate here. Yeah, thank you, Sage, and I'm sorry that is that way. And I will also add that our being part of this learning community conversation, and I really invite you to consider this, our participating in this learning community conversation is working against those kind of social structures, because we are coming together as a group of people and in an open, intentional way, focusing on these issues and engaging in this conversation. And that works toward dismantling these systems. Lindsay writes, 100%. I work at a crisis detox center with adults and youth. I'm a crisis counselor for suicide and mental health, and every client has been through some sort of trauma. Melody, I work with a lot of peers, support specialists, and I know that many in this training have lived experience with mental illness. Understood. There are still many microaggressions in our system related to lived experience with mental illness, and I think mental health and physical ability are areas we need to consider more with intersectionality and privilege. Agreed, Melody, 100%. Marcy writes, I feel like too often in things like care planning, interventions, target behaviors, work, etc., things like systemic isms of all kinds are not taken into account, and the burden is put too much on the person to be responsible for the state of what is going on in their life and how they have responded to usually multiple traumas, especially in private healthcare systems. Thank you, Marcy. And very, very poignant and important what you noted in the chat there. So hopefully during this learning community conversation, we'll all be considering our relationship to cultural humility. Hopefully everybody will leave here with some sort of description or understanding of how the tandem use of cultural humility and MI can support a trauma-informed approach. And hopefully we'll all be thinking about actions that we can take to communicate to the people we sit across from that we are actually a safe person for that LGBTQIA plus 16 person to be sitting across from at that moment. So I'd like to ask everybody, and we have about 111 people in the chat. I'd like to ask everybody on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, I hardly ever think about my safety at all, and 10 being, I think about my safety multiple times a day. Please use the chat to generally sort of indicate how often do you think about your safety? And let's all look at the chat and see what people are putting in. And I'm going to put in what oh, Barbara, thank you for adding that that YouTube video. Yeah, so we're getting somebody typed in 50 plus times. Okay, that's very powerful, and thank you for feeling free to extend the scale as needed. I'm going to type my number into the chat, and then I'm going to follow it with a question. So that's the number that I would put in the chat. And if you didn't see that, yeah, and Stephanie writes, it depends. I put 2. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute, and I'm just going to open it up and just ask, any thoughts about why folks, given everything that I disclosed to you, why I might put my number at 2? And I don't know if anybody wants to unmute and comment on that, but I invite you to do so. So any thoughts about why I might, well, Leslie just put in the chat, you're a male, okay? Yeah, Sage, go ahead.
Why? Sorry.
And Connie just said, Connie, I just want to make sure I heard you properly. Connie said, and you're a WASP, W-A-S-P, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. No, did I get that right? Yep, okay, yep.
That's basically what I was going to say, is that from your outward first glance appearance, nobody would know any sort of identification that would take you out of a demographic that currently is in charge of society.
Yes. So again, Sage, you're very actively connecting me to the social power structure. And Sage is absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I want you to know that I know that that's a privilege too, because I saw it in the chat when one of our learning community colleagues put 50 plus times a day. There are people that think about their safety a lot. And the thing I want us to consider is, if you're thinking about your safety so much, it probably makes it hard to be thinking about other things. And thinking about your safety so much because you want to stay alive probably has an impact. And if you agree with this statement, type an A in the chat. If you disagree, type a D. But if you're thinking about your safety so frequently, there's a strong chance it's having an effect on your physical health, your mental health, and possibly your well-being overall. So if you agree with that, type an A in the chat. Yeah, and I see that there's some disagreement, and that's okay, because again, our goal is not necessarily whether we agree, it's to get a sense of where we stand on this idea. Okay? And also to consider where we're coming from in regard to this idea. There is a lot of data that shows, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but there's lots of studies that have been done that show, and the ACEs study is one of them that you may all be familiar with, is that folks who've experienced childhood traumatic events are more susceptible to physical health problems, mental health problems, and substance use as a form of coping. So just keeping in mind that there is data that actually connects to this idea of how people's considerations about safety, lack of access to care, experience of traumatic events, how it actually affects their emotional, physical health, and the trajectory of their lives. So just keeping that in mind as well. Yes, and the environment does matter. Absolutely. Yeah, Noelle, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead, please.
I think if you're going to inspire motivation to change to your clients, then that same inspiration has to be within yourself. So it doesn't, I don't think looking at your own self-care or self-safety would detract from the treatment approach. I think it would enhance it. So that's an opposite thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it makes perfect sense. If you're focusing on making sure that you're staying well and staying safe, you're probably going to more effectively be able to do your job. The point that I'm making is, how frequently do you as an individual, your job aside, how frequently do you as an individual have to consider whether you're safe or not safe? Because the point I'd really like you to walk away with is that there are many people, and some of them in this learning community, that have to think about their safety quite a bit for a variety of reasons. And I agree with you 100%, Noelle. That could in no way preclude you from being very effective at your job. In fact, having that lived experience might even make you more effective at your job. So that's absolutely. There are lots of people, and we've seen many Hollywood movies and independent films who tell the stories of many people who've experienced overwhelming, crushing traumatic experiences in their lives, and they've been able to transcend that for a variety of reasons in order to make profound and extraordinary contributions to the community and to communities at large, to the world at large. There are a lot of people that movies don't get made about, though, who don't have that kind of resiliency or don't have that kind of support. And that's not their failing. So just keeping that in mind. So I'm going to share my screen again, introducing this idea of safety, and also thinking about what helps us individually to feel safe. And that can be very unique to each individual. And, some people may feel safe if they feel like someone's really listening to them, or if someone's really trying to understand them. So just keeping in mind that what makes a person feel safe is not necessarily a cookie cutter approach. And to illustrate that point, I wanted to show you this picture, which, if you've ever been in a learning community conversation with me before, you've probably seen this picture before. I don't know about you, but for me, this is a picture of the Grand Canyon. I took this picture. I've been here 11 times. And for me, I experience what some may say is a big, dirty hole in the ground. I experience this place as profoundly safe and profoundly serene. And it's so much so, and this is a very idiosyncratic personal statement, so much so that when in the year 2000, on New Year's Eve, when many people thought the world was going to end or computers were going to blow up, I asked myself before that event, if the world were going to end, where would you want to be? And I told myself, I want to be at the Grand Canyon. So I spent New Year's Eve at the Grand Canyon in the year 2020 or in 2000. So I mention that because, again, we need to be thinking about what may help the person across from us to feel safe. And I just wanted to share this with you as kind of an idiosyncratic, because safety is a very individual, a very personal thing. Yeah, Sage, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead, please. Sage is unmuting.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting. I just wanted to add, I really think it's important that we make that note about perceived safety, because safety does look different to every individual. And for example, I feel very safe in small enclosed environments. For other people, that is the worst case they can be in. So it's keeping in mind what I think is safe for my client may not be what they see as safe for themselves.
Absolutely. And again, I love the way you put that, Sage, because those are our glasses again. Like a better explanation using Sage's language is that the Grand Canyon in my glasses feels safe. In somebody else's glasses, no way. Desert, no water, hostile environment, pass. I'm not going there. Rattlesnakes, I'm not going there. You know what I mean? So it is clearly unique and through the glasses of that individual. And it behooves us to pay attention to that uniqueness. And Sage, your example is so beautiful, because let's say I'm meeting, I'm in a meeting with Noelle, and Noelle has a very small, tiny office. And I walk into Noelle's office and I start to feel really panicky. I start to feel really uncomfortable because maybe the space is triggering me. We would want to notice that. So just being aware of, just because something feels safe to us, it may not feel, and again, I love the way Sage put it, perceived safety, because the person's perception matters. What do you mean you don't feel safe in here? It's an office. Well, if you don't feel safe, you don't feel safe, period. All right, a couple of other things came in the chat. I just want to make sure that I look at them. Someone's nonverbal cues can be helpful in addition to what they say about this. Sometimes people say they're okay and feel okay, but then their body language says the opposite. Yeah, very true. Very true, Marcy. Safety is all about just like how much you trust the ground on which you're standing. Yeah, and you know, I love that image, because it would really depend on what ground I was standing on and what state that ground might be in as to how safe or unsafe. To me, safety is related to self-esteem. Yeah, absolutely. And some people related to that, Adolfo, absolutely. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Oh, but I saw something else popped in the chat. Let me just quickly check it. It's also why when I speak with a client for the first time, I ask them where they would feel most comfortable to talk. Yes, and you know something, Sage? There are two things in what you're saying. You're acknowledging that what may feel comfortable for you may not be comfortable for them. And two, you're also inviting them to exercise their autonomy. And talk about helping somebody to feel safe. Let them make a choice. Let them guide you. Very powerful. I agree. Safety can equate to self-esteem. Yeah, there can be a very powerful connection to that. Truly. All right, folks, going forward. Now, I one time was in Pittsburgh, and I was going to be speaking at a transgender health conference. I was invited to speak about cultural humility and motivational interviewing. And the day before I was supposed to speak, I was enjoying the conference and I was participating in other workshops, and I was in a particular large group. You know, it was like a plenary talk that somebody was giving, and they got up in front of the room and took center stage and they said, "I'm an expert in cultural competence." Now, I don't know about you, but I had a strong reaction to that statement from this particular person. Andrea writes, so I guess you can say that someone growing up in unsafe environments, they would automatically grow up not with I'm not sure what the NUP is.
It was a mistake. It meant grow up. They were automatic, because based on one of the statements when they said, I'm sorry, that, you know, safety is based on self-esteem. So, I mean, and basically we're more like in presence or adulthood. So I guess I'm saying you can say then, you know, that if someone grew up in unsafe environments or what they perceive to be unsafe, then they would automatically grow up with self-esteem issues. That's I mean.
Yeah. You know, Andrea, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm sorry I misread it in what you said. And I think the thing we want to be careful of is, I think when folks are saying that for them, safety is connected to self-esteem, they're making an I statement. They're talking about themselves. So I wouldn't want to make the assumption that just because somebody grows up in an environment, quote unquote, that somebody else might experience as unsafe, that person may not have self-esteem. I think when we start to guess somebody else's experience, we can run into a lot of trouble. So I think we want to be clear that the person across from us will tell us or give us indications of what is safe for them or not safe for them. They'll give us a sense of what their self-esteem is or what their self-esteem isn't. I don't think we can make any absolute statements like, if you grow up in an unsafe environment, you're not going to have any self-esteem. And Andrea, I don't think that's what you're saying. But I think if somebody, quote unquote, tells us that they grew up in unsafe environments, I would sure as heck want to pay attention to that. I would sure as heck want to get a sense of, how does that impact them today? What is their environment like today? Andrea, did you want to comment or do you want to respond to that at all?
No, I'm just saying, I'm not personalizing or nothing, but that was one thing that caught my eye. Yeah. So in other words, and to be honest with you, I'm speaking from my experiences when I give my opinion. You understand? This is not, you know, I'm no expert or none of that. Right. I'm sharing my thoughts. You understand? And I'm saying it's almost like you can say then, and I find that's my truth. I find truth to that too. You understand? I'm not disclaiming. I'm just saying, you know, maybe I didn't take the time to write it long, but I was just trying to get it in. So I gave a short paragraph, but in some ways, if I'm pretty sure if a person grew up unsafe, you're going to have self-esteem issues. Grew up, I'm talking about over a period of time, you know, childhood, adolescent, you know, early adulthood, 21, whatever, you know, whether it's through drug addiction, sexual assault, domestic violence, you name it, you know, identity. Or all of the above. All of the above. So that's all I was saying. That's it.
Yeah. And Andrea, thank you, because you are the expert of your experience.
Exactly.
And what you're really acknowledging is that things that impacted you negatively have had an impact on your self-esteem.
Exactly.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that in the learning community.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to share my screen again, because what I'd like you to consider, folks, is I'd like you to consider that cultural competence, which is a very common phrase that's used a lot, is you'll notice that I've kind of placed it in the background and I'm making the expert part of it disappear with the magic of PowerPoint. But what I'd like us to consider is that cultural competence is aspirational. It's not something we can ever reach. We're always doing our best to walk toward being able to provide the best, most engaging, most refined care we can to the people that we have the opportunity to provide services to. But cultural competence as a goal is not really attainable. There is probably only one instance where we'll ever be culturally competent. And it's funny because I was in a conversation about this the other day, and probably Andrea just gave a wonderful example, because Andrea is culturally competent in her experience. She is the expert of her experience. And, I continue to do a lot of work on being culturally competent in the experience of Paul Warren. And that's really the only place where I may ever be culturally competent. I can never be culturally competent in Andrea's experience or anybody else's in this learning community conversation. So I'd like you to instead consider this idea of cultural humility. And I'm going to invite you to take a moment to read this slide, and I'll stop talking so you can do that, and then I'll read it out loud, and then we'll have a little bit of a talk about it. Cultural humility perspective. Lifelong learning process, self-examination, and refinement of one's own awareness, knowledge, behavior, and attitudes on the interplay of power, privilege, and social contexts. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen for a moment and just ask, and I'm wondering, Anna, would you or your colleague or colleagues, because I see that there are 3 people there. Hey, welcome. I hope your name got in the chat because you're here too. I wonder if any of the 3 of you would like to comment on that sort of description, and then maybe we can go to Myra, but any thoughts about that particular definition of cultural humility? And I'll show it again, and then you can unmute and let us know if you have any thoughts, if any of you have any thoughts or any reactions to that. And then maybe we can go to Myra, and then maybe to Donna Cobb, if Donna has anything she'd like to add about it too. So any thoughts or any reactions to this definition? Lifelong process of learning, self-examination and refinement of one's own awareness, knowledge, behavior, and attitudes on the interplay of power, privilege, and social contexts. So what do you think, Anna? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, we can all give our statement if you'd like, or if you want.
That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. And that would give Myra as well as Donna an opportunity to frame what they may want to say, if there's anything they want to say. Go right ahead.
All right. So, I'll start since I already started talking. I think it's something that I've been learning for the past few years, and without knowing the exact language of what it was, I was already doing it as a recent social worker who just graduated. So I'll just here. It is something that has been put in practice for a very long time, because regardless, I think it's really well stated. It is a learning process. And I think adding the motivational interviewing interplays with that really nicely on asking questions, not making assumptions, and being well aware of where you stand, whether it be with clinician and client, supervisor, coworker, parent, child, whatever the case may be, and not assuming that just because someone is Latino, someone is queer, that who they are. So I think it's really important, instead of just assuming or making statements, that you ask those questions, because it can be very different for everyone else.
Super, thank you. And either of your colleagues? Yeah, go right ahead.
Hi, my name is Elise Rivera. I can't even follow up with Anna. That was so amazing. Very well put. But yes, I think cultural humility is really important, especially working with youth. All of us working with youth over here. I think it's super important. I think it's really important to also sit back and listen, like Anna said. For me, for example, I'm a white presenting Latina. So the kids that I work with are usually BIPOC kids. And I've had pushback and I've had them tell me like, what do you know? You're a white girl. And I'm like, you're not wrong. That's the first thing they see when they see me. So, it's really hard to kind of step out of that as well, right? Because the first thing I want to do is get defensive and be like, I'm not white. But I'll say, okay, what makes you think that about me, right? And we'll have a conversation. And as that conversation is going, I'll say, okay, well, I appreciate you observing what you see, but, I'm not white. I speak Spanish. I grew up in a Puerto Rican household, Ecuadorian household. Like, my culture is very much embedded in me. I speak the language, I eat the food, I listen to the music. And for white people, I'm not white. This has been my whole life experiencing like, where do I juggle, right? Because I'm not white. And I was always too Hispanic for the white kids. And I was always too white for the Hispanic kids. So, and it honestly, it always turns out to be great conversations. And it's always learning curves with them. So they're always like, oh, okay, you know what? Thank you for telling me, you're still white to me. And I'm like, all right, cool. And we'll make a joke out of it. Or we'll create that bond somehow. And then by the third or fourth meeting we're having, it's not even an issue anymore. So definitely like obviously the first thing is to get defensive, but like stepping out of that and being like, you know what, why am I getting so defensive? And it's not a bad thing, but it's also not something that we want to jump to right away.
Naming it.
Correct. And I'll pass it to my colleague.
My name is Nikaya S. Reyes. So yeah, I'm following up with that and going back to the root of talking about the definition. Like I disclose a lot of the time that I'm neurodivergent. Specificity is very, very important to someone who is neurodivergent, and how you use your words and the words that you do use. So when we talk about competence versus humility, not that specific definition and action of itself is so different. To acknowledge and understand or acknowledge, and just to acknowledge is one thing versus understanding that you don't have privilege in this space, or understanding that you don't have necessarily those shoes to fill. You know what I'm saying? And also, I love the definition of it being a lifelong process. You're always going to be learning. When you feel competent or an expert at something, you feel like there's not really much for you to learn, versus if I humble myself constantly and I have these kinds of conversations, especially when I'm talking to kids, and I look to be as specific as possible, right? Like as specific as I can get is the most humbling experience to someone who, like, obviously I'm not white. So when a kid is talking about a very privileged feeling or something that is going on for them, I'm able to be like, okay, well, specify what this is like, because in my upbringing, this is how I've kind of understood this. And I just don't understand. I don't really know what that's like. Being as specific as possible and like try to ask these questions, the words that I use is such a powerful experience, even for me. Because if someone comes up to me and they're like, oh, I'm competent in this, and they may have had the best intentions, they could even be an empathetic person. If we're not very specific in the language that we use, it can easily be taken another way, or honestly, just confusing. So I think it's really important that the terms that we use, we're constantly aspiring to be as clear as possible, to be as direct as possible, because a lot of these neurodivergent, which is like 80% of our caseload here, is really comes down to the words in the language that we use, because each culture uses words in a different way, or they use slang in a different way, or constantly we're going in different high schools and we're like, what is this new slang term? Like to try and understand like what is being said, because this is very specific to them. But 10, 15, 20 years ago, this word may mean something completely different now. I mean, even when talking to older groups, right, they still ask us, is queer okay to use? Because years before, and that's their version of cultural humility, right? Like they're looking to humble themselves and be like, well, when I was growing up, this was like a very horrible thing to say. I want to make sure this is genuinely a word that is accepted by the masses, so that I'm not offending anyone. So it's very important that the language that we use is very direct and very clear.
Yeah, self-awareness is key.
Thank you. Wow, 3 Thank you, all three of you so much. Thank you. And Myra, the floor is yours, and then we're going to go to Donna Cobb.
No, I just want to say I think walk in life in my work with open heart and love and compassion. And I try to be aware every day what are my bias, what I feel irritable in the train every day is related with a person, with a race, what happened with me. Be aware about my bias every day.
Yeah. And you know, I want to underline something that you said, Myra, because it is a job that we choose to take on every day. Because it is something that requires attention every day. Thank you. Thanks. And Donna, we'll give you the last kind of if you have any thoughts or reactions to that definition, if you even remember it from a while ago.
Well, I was just wondering why I got selected. Was it my facial expressions or was it because I was freshening up my lip gloss? I'm not sure, but I was just, just jotting down some notes and taking consideration of, how rapidly you really become older and kind of out of touch. And I perceive myself to be middle-aged or a younger middle-aged, but that's not necessarily the case. There's constantly changing vernacular.
Yeah.
Just the culture, the culture is changing. And while I think that I'm changing with the culture, I constantly find myself trying to catch up. So like today with the term recently, so I was slightly familiar with the term cisgender. So I was feeling on top of it, right? And then I hear neurodivergent, and then I'm over here Googling like neurodivergent, never heard, like it's always something to learn. And I think with regard to, I guess, cultural competence and I'm a outpatient therapist, by the way, but just competency as a decent human being.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that we continue to learn and be open-minded. And then I was thinking, because looking at my face sometimes in the boxes and the cubes, and I'm like, oh my gosh, my forehead is wrinkled. But it's not because I'm judging. It's because information, a lot of this is new to me, and it just has not been my experience. It hasn't been my exposure. And again, I'm rapidly aging, like not even realizing it, because in my heart, in my brain, I still feel young, but society is like moving, changing, always something new, always a new classification, a new label, whether, and what was that one about not minority, but what I don't
Minoritizing,
like all of these modified, I'm a former English teacher, but modified terms to reflect the needs of our now society. I just have to just keep up with it all. So I just appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I hope you all can follow my ADHD brain.
Well, Donna, I want to thank you for speaking. I was able to follow you 100%. And, I love the fact that you wanted to clarify that, my brow may be wrinkled, but I'm not judging. I'm opening myself up to learning. And that's the beauty of our being together in this learning community conversation. We're getting the opportunity to have that influence on each other. So thank you for accepting that invitation. And thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So a bunch of things have come into the chat. Marcy writes also that similar is not same. Even if I have some similar experiences in common with a client, I don't have the same lived experience that they do. So true, Marcy. And I am not an expert on their experience. They know their own life best. That needs to be respected. I appreciate you, Donna, Ariel says. And Megan thinks that was great, Donna. These are all messages to Donna. Yes, Donna, that was so real and in the here and now. Absolutely. Sage, thank you for helping me see how my own privilege with your comment, Donna. I send a lot of Thai and college students, which helps me. I think I spend a lot of time with college students that help me to stay current terms and language and concepts within younger society. Observation is not judgment. Yes, Noel, and learning is not judgment. Absolutely. Donna, amazing. I've been getting some adolescent clients and realizing exactly how out of touch I am. LOL. Donna, you really struck a nerve. People are identifying with what you said. Stephanie, agree, Sage. I work at a university, and that is the only way I keep up with the changes and trends. Yes. Stephanie, agreed, Sage. Oh, yes. And there's another person is agreeing with that too. Excellent. So folks, I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to move from that definition into a little bit of operationalizing what it is to, and I'm going to use Myra's words here, what it is to make the choice to do that work on a daily basis. Because cultural humility is a lifelong process, and it's a lifelong perspective in the way that we will approach who maybe is sitting in front of us. So, keeping that in mind, what we're invited to consider in the process of cultural humility is that we engage in self-reflection and self-critique. And self-critique doesn't mean negative. It means that we're just simply reflective on our interactions with others and where we find ourselves in those interactions. Are our triggers activated, or are buttons pushed during particular conversations? And that's would be very good information to know. And how do we think that conversation went? What do you think, what did we learn from that conversation about ourselves and about the person we were in the conversation with? The other thing that we're invited to do is to check the power imbalances that inherently exist in the provider-client relationship by being client-centered or patient-focused in the care and in the way we communicate, that we are engaging with this person as a collaborative partner. And also, we can hopefully assess anew the cultural dimensions of every person, because no two people's intersectionality or no two people's identities are the same. So yes, we may have worked with a woman who identifies as a Latina lesbian. It doesn't mean that the next woman who identifies as a Latina and a lesbian is going to be the same as the woman we met before. And I know that that may seem like a painfully obvious statement. And I think as human beings, sometimes because we want to help, because we want to do the right thing, we might make assumptions because we're trying to expedite a process. And again, cultural humility is saying, be with the person in the moment that we're with, who's in front of us at this particular moment, and see them for their whole being. And again, as much as they've chosen to disclose to us. Also, we recognize that we're not any better than the people that we serve, and that they are the experts of their lives and their communities, and they will choose to disclose that information and teach us about those things if indeed that is their choice. We can also intentionally engage in partnerships with people as opposed to paternalistic relationships where we're the big father expert. We can be in a collaborative partnership, and we can also be in collaborative partnerships with communities as well as individuals. And then the last thing to consider in terms of a broad sort of structure of cultural humility is that we are aware of our own values, our own beliefs, our own information, and we acknowledge that they belong to us and they are not the norm, meaning that they are not necessarily what is quote unquote normal, and they are not the majority. They are simply our values, our belief, and our knowledge. Just like somebody else in this learning community conversation may have different values, different beliefs, and different knowledge than any one of us. It doesn't make ours any more or any less valuable, but we need to intentionally consider that we're not assuming that what we believe, what we think is the norm. And then the last piece of it, and this was, has been touched on through all five of the people five of the people we heard from in regard to the definition, is that we remain open to learning about ourselves, learning about the people in front of us, learning about the communities that we have the opportunity to be interacting with. So that's kind of an overview of cultural humility. Now, what I'd like to throw out for our consideration is a couple of key concepts related to LGBTQIA+ identities. One is that genitalia, the genitalia that somebody has, their sexual organs, do not dictate their gender identity. Now, I know that all of you can see me at this particular point. You also know that I identified as a sex at birth male. My gender identity, which you can't see, but I told you what it was, is also male. And because my assigned sex at birth and my gender identity are in alignment, that is the definition of what cisgender means. And as I mentioned before, I acknowledge for myself that that is a privilege because I don't often have to think about my gender identity. So keeping in mind that one's sex organs don't necessarily, it is possible that someone who could have ambiguous genitalia, meaning that they are an intersexed person, may identify as female or male or anywhere on that spectrum. I have a colleague that I worked with who I respect tremendously and always enjoyed working with, a colleague named Carrie Davis. And Carrie used to always say there are as many gender identities as there are people on the planet, because no two people actually experience their gender the same. Another thing to keep in mind is that conformity, passing, and it was mentioned earlier, Sage, you mentioned this when we were talking about why I gave my rating of 2 in terms of how often I think about my safety. Being able to pass or conform or align with the structures of power confers privilege to people. And I'm very well aware of the fact that as a sex at birth male with a male gender identity who has European heritage and white skin privilege, I have been afforded a great deal of power and privilege. I am aware of that. And I, on a daily basis, make conscious efforts to try and share that power with folks. So again, keeping in mind that there is often great price for non-conformity. And that price sometimes is people are killed. And they may be traumatized and abused. And Paulette mentioned microaggressions, and somebody mentioned death by 1,000 cuts. Non-conformity, folks, divergence from the quote unquote identified power structure is often within our culture punished. So just keeping those two concepts in mind. I think we've been talking about this, why providers need to understand gender and sexual orientation, and I'll just add to it. Providers need to understand these two things so that they can better know who the person is across from them and provide them the best care possible. So when we're thinking about providing care to LGBTQIA individuals, and we focus on some of the very basic things that we want to be offering LGBTQIA plus 16 individuals, and frankly, that we'd want to be offering anybody, are safety, welcome, respect, and trust. And I would also add that all of those four basics are things that have to actually be earned. Why, when somebody's coming to services, why should they assume that you're trustworthy? They don't know you. They also may be coming in with an experience of where they were not treated well. So what I'd like to throw out is that cultural humility and the use of motivational interviewing can really help us to actively communicate to people that it is safe for them to be with us, that we are welcoming them, we are offering them respect, and over time, we can be trusted. So remember, this is just briefly touching on the concept of motivational interviewing. If this is something you're interested in, if you'd like to know more about motivational interviewing, please do join us for future learning community conversations. Sage mentions in the chat, as a side note, if you are making a safety plan with the transgender client, please understand that bathroom access in situations where the only bathroom is shared is not a safe environment for them. Thank you. And Noelle is asking, why the gold bars? I'll explain that in just a minute. Melody says, I love the gender unicorn and had not thought before about emotional and physical attraction, potentially both being on the spectrum. Yeah. And you've also, Melody, thank you so much. You've also added a link in the chat. So to Noelle's question of why the gold bars. The gold bars are because motivational interviewing, I like to think of it as conversational gold. It is a way to actually effectively engage in conversation with people. And keep in mind that motivational interviewing, first and foremost, is a client-centered conversation. It's a conversation that's guided by the worker, and it is focused, when it's the practice of motivational interviewing, it's focused collaboratively on an identified behavioral change goal. And the worker is intentionally guiding that conversation to stay focused on that change goal, exploring the person's ambivalence about the change goal and their motivations for wanting to make the change, not our motivations. So let me make something very clear. When we use the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing, we are not motivating the client. We are engaging in an intentional kind of conversation that helps the client to motivate themselves. If that's intriguing to you and you want to find out more about that, please do attend additional learning community conversations that will go very deeply into the practice of motivational interviewing. It is often misunderstood that motivational interviewing is a way to motivate. It is not. It is a way to identify the person's motivations that then motivate that person. We are not motivating them. We are intentionally engaging in a form of communication that helps them identify their own motivations, their desire, their ability, their reasons, or their need to make a particular change. And we are helping them to explore their ambivalence, why they want to make the change and why they want to remain the same. So again, There's a lot more that can be said about this highly studied evidence-based practice that can be very effective in helping people to identify and make a behavioral change. There is a guiding principle to motivational interviewing, which is called MI spirit. And it's the way we want to be as we are engaging in a conversation with somebody. And whether we are actually practicing motivational interviewing or not, we can still be engaging with them in an MI spirited way. And let me just take a brief moment to walk us through what that means. It means, first and foremost, that at the heart of our conversation, we are engaging in a collaborative partnership. And let me give a concrete example. Let's say Noelle is my service provider, and I have the opportunity to be working with her. She is choosing to interact with me in a way that acknowledges my expertise as the human being that I am, and it also acknowledges her expertise as the human being and experienced provider that she is. So we are collaborative partners. She is not presenting herself as the expert or the authority. Acceptance in MI spirit means 4 specific things, and they all begin with A. First, that as a human being, the person across from us has what is called absolute worth. No matter what they've done, no matter what they're doing, they have value. 2, we are going to affirm their efforts and their strengths. 3, we are going to honor their autonomy, meaning that they will ultimately decide what or if there's anything they want to do involved in their care. And the last of the 4 A's under acceptance is something called accurate empathy. Accurate empathy means simply that we will do our best to try and understand it from their perspective. What's important to them? What's meaningful to them? What the term or the language actually means to them. And that's what acceptance means under MI spirit. Compassion simply means we're putting their welfare above our own agenda. And we seek to empower people when we practice motivational interviewing. And when we're engaging with them in an MI spirited way, we seek to empower them by inviting them to exercise their autonomy and honoring their choice. And I'm going to give you a concrete example. You may have observed that I've invited people to offer comments during this particular learning community conversation. I've asked their permission. Is it okay if I ask you a question? That is a form of empowerment because they can say, and I hope people know this, you can say, no, I actually don't want to be asked a question at this particular point. So a very simple way to empower somebody is, would it be okay if I asked you a question? And if they say no, honor their answer. That is a way to build trust and to build rapport. Yeah, so a couple of things are coming in the chat. Okay, fantastic. Susan Beth, good to know. How would you respond to those who believe that MI is manipulation or unethical? Larry, wonderful question, and I'm so glad you asked it. I'm going to respond. Andrea writes, manipulation has a negative connotation. However, manipulation is an art and can be useful in bringing about positive results. And Paulette writes, interesting point of view. Willamette writes, adaptation rather than manipulation. So I love the fact that Larry asked that question, and let me respond to it this way. As someone who has been practicing and training about motivational interviewing since 2003, so it's been about 20 years now, This idea of motivational interviewing being cast as a form of manipulation is fairly current and fairly present a lot of the time. And I love it when it comes up because I want to make something very clear about it. MI spirit, the C, the compassion in MI spirit, because we're putting their welfare and their agenda and their goal above our own agenda, helps keep it from being manipulation. The change goal, if we're practicing MI, is a client-centered change goal, meaning that it's a change goal that they chose. And the other thing that really keeps it from being manipulation is that the motivations that the person is considering that help them to want to make the change are their motivations. They're not our motivations to make the change. So when I'm practicing motivational interviewing, I'm not trying to persuade anybody. I'm not trying to pressure them. And to be quite honest, I'm actually not trying to educate them. It doesn't mean that I may not offer educational information if they are open to it. And I will honor their autonomy if I do share information about what they decide to do or not do. So the fact that we're using their desire, their ability, their reasons, or their need, not ours, as the engine of their building their motivation, that is what keeps it from being manipulation. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, Larry, because sometimes it's in the air, but people don't take the risk to actually ask the question as honestly as you asked it. And I thank you for actually putting that on the table. And by all means, if you want to unmute and respond to that, please do. Or if anybody else does, of course, please feel free to do so. And Noel says, I'd prefer to call it multidimensional. Okay, sure, absolutely. So the other thing I think to keep in mind about motivational interviewing as we start to draw our conversation to a close, that these are the core communication skills associated with the evidence-based practice of motivational interviewing. And the thing I'd like everybody to understand is that simply using these skills, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, or summaries, does not mean you're practicing motivational interviewing. It means you may be asking an open-ended question, offering an affirmation, a reflection, or a summary. It's when they are used intentionally, focused on an identified behavioral change goal, where you are exploring ambivalence and strengthening motivations. That is when the tools are used in service of the practice motivational interviewing. Atia writes, manipulation is power over, whereas MI is power to or with. Yeah, and motivational interviewing also is that they have the power. We don't have the power. We're just facilitating an intentional conversation. So keeping that in mind, just a couple of other things to consider as final thoughts is that when we're practicing motivational interviewing, folks, we want to be trying to attend and listen on 4 levels simultaneously, with our ears, with our eyes, with our heart, and with our gut. We want to try and be operating, attending, and listening on all 4 of those levels at the same time. Does anybody know where this image is from? What Walt Disney, I'm giving you a clue, what Walt Disney film this image is from? And if you know, type it in the chat. Yes, people are absolutely correct. It is from the movie, the animated film Snow White, which I believe was Disney's first animated full-length feature. I could be wrong about that. If somebody wants to check me on that, that would be great. I think it was, though. I mention it because the question that we can always be asking ourselves when we're sitting across from an LGBTQIA plus 16 individual that we may know of. We may be sitting across from people that we don't know anything about their sexual orientation or their gender identity or other aspects of their identity. Are you safe? And I don't mean, are you personally safe? What I mean is it safe for them to be sitting across from you? And what I'd ask you to consider is you can choose how you'll interact with an LGBTQIA plus person that you have the opportunity to partner with. And you can choose to intentionally engage in cultural humility and offer an am-I consistent approach through partnership, acceptance, compassion, and empowerment. Having said that, folks, I can't thank you enough for everything that you brought to this learning community conversation today, for your willingness to share your identities, to talk about yourselves and your experience. It's really been a privilege to be here with all of you today, to get to know you a little bit better. Please be well, take good care, and I hope we'll get to see each other again soon. Thank you.